In the modern world, we are obsessed with wealth. We track the net worth of tech giants and oil tycoons, marveling at billions. But if we turn back the clock 700 years, we find a man whose wealth was so vast that it transcends modern calculation. He didn't have a digital bank account or stock options. He had a literal empire of gold. He was Mansa, the king of kings. His name was Mansa Musa. While 14th century Europe was plunging into the Dark Ages, crippled by the Black Death and endless feudal wars, a golden sun was rising over West Africa. The Mali Empire was not just a kingdom, it was a global economic engine that the rest of the world barely understood. It was a land where gold was said to grow like plants in the ground, and where a single ruler held the keys to the world's economy. Today, on The Past in Focus, we begin a 4-part journey into the life of the richest human being to ever walk the earth. This is the saga of Mansa Musa and the Golden Empire of Mali. The story of Mali's opulence begins long before Musa wore the crown. The empire was founded by the legendary Sundiata Keita, known as the Lion King. Sundiata was a warrior prince who united the Mandinka tribes into a powerful federation. He laid the groundwork for a stable, organized state, but it was under Mansa Musa that Mali reached its zenith. Musa's rise to power in 1312 was shrouded in the mystery of exploration. The previous ruler, Mansa Abu Bakr II, was obsessed with the Atlantic Ocean. He believed the sea had an edge, a final boundary, and he intended to find it. He equipped 2,000 ships and sailed west, never to be seen again. As was the custom, his deputy, a young, ambitious man named Musa, ascended to the throne. Musa inherited an empire that was already a giant. It stretched across 2,000 miles, encompassing the modern-day nations of Mauritania, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Niger, and Nigeria. It was larger than almost any kingdom in Europe at the time. But Musa knew that size alone didn't guarantee greatness. To make Mali immortal, he needed to control the two things the medieval world craved most: gold and salt. To understand Mansa Musa's power, you must understand the geography of wealth. Mali sat directly atop the world's most productive gold mines, Bambouk, Bouré, and Galam. At a time when Europe and the Middle East were desperate for gold to mint their coins, Mali was providing more than half of the world's entire supply. For Musa, gold wasn't a luxury, it was a resource as common as the dust under his feet. But gold alone can't feed an empire. Musa's genius lay in his control of the trans-Saharan trade. To the north of Mali lay the great salt mines of the Sahara. In the Middle Ages, salt was known as white gold. Without refrigeration, salt was the only way to preserve meat and sustain life. In some parts of Africa, salt was traded for gold at a ratio of 1:1. Musa turned Mali into the ultimate middleman. Every camel caravan carrying salt from the north or gold from the south had to pass through his territory. He taxed every ounce of goods that crossed his borders. In exchange, his massive army, 100,000 soldiers strong, guaranteed the safety of the merchants. This created a cycle of infinite wealth. The safer the roads, the more merchants came. The more merchants came, the richer Musa grew. He wasn't just a king, he was the CEO of the world's most profitable trade route. As the gold piled up in his treasury, Musa turned his attention to his legacy. He didn't want Mali to be remembered only for its money. He wanted it to be a center of civilization. He focused his efforts on a small trading post that would soon become one of the most famous cities in human history, Timbuktu. Under Musa's patronage, Timbuktu was transformed from a desert outpost into a global intellectual hub. He understood that while gold could be stolen or spent, knowledge was a permanent asset. He began inviting the world's greatest architects, mathematicians, and poets to his court.
he built the famous Jingareber Mosque, a masterpiece of earthen architecture that still stands today as a testament to his vision. In the libraries of Timbuktu, books were more valuable than gold. It was a city where the elite didn't brag about their jewelry, but about the size of their manuscript collections. Scholars from Cairo, Baghdad, and Granada traveled thousands of miles just to study in the universities Musa funded. By the time he was a decade into his reign, Mali was the most sophisticated state in Africa, but the world outside of the desert still viewed the King of Gold as a myth. That was about to change. In 1324, Mansa Musa decided it was time to introduce himself to the world. He decided to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. Mansa Musa's decision to perform the Hajj was not just a religious act, it was the ultimate diplomatic mission. He intended to lead a caravan across the Sahara that would defy belief. He wasn't just bringing his family, he was bringing his entire court, thousands of soldiers, and so much gold that it would require dozens of camels just to carry the luggage. As the news of the expedition spread, the world waited in anticipation. This was to be the most expensive road trip in human history, a journey that would collapse economies, rewrite maps, and cement Mansa Musa's name in the annals of legend forever. How do you think a city would react if a king arrived with 60,000 people and tons of gold? Let us know in the comments below. This is the Past in Focus. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss Mansa Musa's golden journey. The greatest trek in history is about to begin. In the year 1324, the horizon of the Sahara Desert didn't just shimmer with heat, it glowed with the reflection of pure gold. Mansa Musa was about to embark on a journey that would redefine the world's understanding of wealth. Leaving his capital of Niani, the emperor began a pilgrimage to Mecca that was less of a personal journey and more of a mobile city moving across the shifting sands. Imagine a line of people and animals stretching for miles, a golden serpent slithering through the dunes. Musa did not travel like a humble pilgrim, he traveled like the sovereign of the world. Historical accounts from the era describe a caravan of 60,000 people. This staggering number included 12,000 servants, each dressed in the finest Persian silks. But the most striking sight was the vanguard, 500 heralds marching at the very front, each carrying a staff of solid gold that weighed 6 pounds. This was a spectacle designed to stun the world. Behind them followed 80 camels, each laden with 300 pounds of gold dust. In total, Musa was transporting over 24,000 pounds of gold across the desert. It was a display of opulence so extreme that it felt like a myth coming to life. To move 60,000 people across the world's harshest desert was a feat of logistics that rivaled the construction of the pyramids. This was a massive operation requiring military precision. Musa had to coordinate water stops at secret oases, manage food supplies for an army of followers, and ensure the safety of his immense treasure from desert raiders. Yet the emperor was not just focused on survival, he was focused on his faith and his legacy. Everywhere the caravan stopped, Musa's impact was immediate. Every Friday, wherever the caravan found itself, Musa ordered the construction of a new mosque. He was a benefactor to every village and outpost the caravan touched. He didn't just pass through these lands, he transformed them. He gave away gold to the poor, funded local leaders, and bought exotic goods at inflated prices just to spread his wealth. But as the caravan approached the great city of Cairo, the heart of the Mamluk Sultanate, this extreme generosity was about to face its greatest test and trigger an economic disaster that would echo for a decade. When Mansa Musa arrived in Cairo, the city was the cultural and economic capital of the Islamic world. The Sultan of Egypt, Al-Nasser Muhammad, was a powerful ruler who expected everyone to bow before him. But Musa was a Mansa, a king of kings. The meeting between the two leaders was a moment of high diplomatic tension. Initially, Musa refused to perform the traditional protocol of kissing the ground before the Sultan, stating that he only bowed to God. Eventually, a compromise was reached, and the two monarchs sat as equals. But the real impact of Musa's visit wasn't political, it was economic. Musa and his followers began to spend their gold with a frenzy that Cairo had never seen. They flooded the local markets, buying everything from rare spices to luxury silks and jewelry. Musa gave massive tips to every official and poured thousands of gold dinars into local charities. However, there is a fundamental law in economics. When the supply of something increases too rapidly, its value drops.
Musa gave away so much gold that its value in Egypt plummeted. The result was a total economic collapse in Cairo. The price of everyday goods like bread, oil, and grain skyrocketed because the currency had been devalued by Musa's kindness. It is estimated that it took over 12 years for the Egyptian economy to fully recover. Mansa Musa remains the only person in recorded history to have single-handedly controlled the price of gold across the entire Mediterranean and Middle East. Leaving a chaotic Cairo behind, Musa continued to Mecca to perform the sacred rites of the Hajj. But the pilgrimage changed him. In the holy city, he was no longer the richest man on earth. He was just one of millions of believers. He met scholars from Spain, Persia, and the Arabian Peninsula. He realized that for Mali to truly become a permanent superpower, it needed more than just a treasury full of gold. It needed an empire of the mind. On his return journey, a strange thing happened. The man who had brought tons of gold actually ran out of money. Having given away almost everything in Cairo and Mecca, Musa was forced to borrow money from local merchants at high interest rates just to get his massive caravan back home. This wasn't seen as a failure, but as a sign of his immense faith and his belief that wealth was a tool for circulation, not hoarding. But Musa didn't return to Mali empty-handed. He brought back the brightest minds of the era, including the famous Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq al-Saili. Musa promised him a fortune to come to Mali and revolutionize its architecture and education. Mansa Musa's return to Mali marked the end of his journey, but the beginning of his empire's true golden age. He had shown the world his wealth, but now he was ready to show them his vision. He was no longer just a king of gold. He was a king of culture and scholarship. He was about to build mosques and universities that would make the name of Mali famous from Europe to Asia. As he crossed back into his borders, the world was already changing. Far away in Europe, cartographers began drawing a new king on their maps, a king holding a golden nugget, sitting on a throne of light, marking the spot where the richest man in history resided. Mansa Musa's return to Mali was not merely a homecoming, it was the beginning of an architectural and intellectual revolution. While his journey to Mecca had depleted his physical gold, it had filled his mind with the grandeur of the wider Islamic world. He did not return alone. Walking alongside the emperor's caravan were some of the most brilliant minds of the 14th century, most notably the Andalusian poet and architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili. Musa had promised the architect a staggering 200 kilograms of gold to bring the styles of Granada and Cairo to the banks of the Niger River. Before this era, West African architecture was primarily functional, but Musa had a vision for a kingdom that reflected its status as a global superpower. He wanted monuments that would speak to the heavens. Under his command, the traditional mud brick style was evolved into a sophisticated art form known as the Sudano-Sahelian style. Al-Sahili introduced the use of burnt bricks and the pyramidal mihrab, creating a unique aesthetic that blended Spanish Moorish grandeur with African soul. This wasn't just construction, it was the birth of a cultural identity that would define West Africa for 1,000 years. The crown jewel of this architectural surge was the Djinguereber Mosque in Timbuktu. Built in 1327, this massive earthen structure was a marvel of engineering. Its walls were made of limestone and mud, reinforced with wooden beams that poked out from the sides, serving as permanent scaffolding for future repairs. It could hold over 2,000 worshippers at once. Musa didn't stop there. He commissioned the building of the Great Mosque in Gao and the Royal Palace in the capital city of Niani. These buildings served a dual purpose. While they were religious centers, they also acted as symbols of Musa's legitimacy and power. By building grand mosques in newly conquered territories like Gao and Timbuktu, he was cementing his authority and integrating these regions into the heart of the Mali Empire. The sight of these towering, sand-colored monuments rising out of the desert became a beacon for travelers and merchants across the continent. Mali was no longer just a place where gold was found, it was a place where gold was used to build the impossible. With the infrastructure in place, Mansa Musa turned his attention to the mind. He transformed Timbuktu into the intellectual capital of Africa. He founded the University of Sankore, which at its peak housed over 25,000 students. To put that into perspective, this was a larger student body than the University of Paris at the time. Education was not just for the elite, it was the currency of the city. Timbuktu became a magnet for scholars from across the globe. Professors from Cairo and Baghdad traveled thousands of miles to teach in its halls. The city's libraries were its greatest pride.
Filled with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts covering everything from Islamic law and medicine to astronomy and mathematics. In Timbuktu, the saying went, "Salt comes from the north, gold from the south, and silver from the white man's country. But the word of God and the treasures of wisdom are only to be found in Timbuktu." The book trade became the most profitable business in the city. A rare manuscript could be sold for more than its weight in gold. Musa created a culture where the intellect was prized above all else. He established a system of justice based on the Quran, ensuring that the vast, diverse empire was governed by a central code of law. This stability allowed trade to flourish even further, as merchants knew that under Musa's law, their property and lives were safe. While Musa was busy building his empire, the news of his 1324 pilgrimage had finally reached the ears of Europe. For centuries, the interior of Africa had been a blank spot on European maps, often labeled with "Here be dragons." But the economic shockwave Musa had caused in Cairo was too massive to ignore. The story of the King of Gold traveled from merchant to merchant, crossing the Mediterranean and reaching the court of the King of Aragon. In 1375, a famous mapmaker named Abraham Crescus created the Catalan Atlas. It was the most important map of the medieval period. At the center of West Africa, it depicted a majestic figure sitting on a throne, wearing a crown of gold and holding a scepter and a large golden nugget. This was Mansa Musa. It was the first time an African ruler was presented to Europe as a peer to their own kings, a sovereign of immense power and dignity. This map would later inspire the likes of Christopher Columbus and other European explorers to find a way to the legendary land of gold, eventually leading to a collision of worlds that Musa could never have imagined. By the final years of his reign, Mansa Musa had achieved what few rulers in history ever have. He had taken a wealthy kingdom and turned it into an enlightened empire. Mali was a land of peace, where the traveler was safe and the scholar was king. The gold mines continued to flow, but the streets of Timbuktu were now paved with knowledge. Musa had built a world that was as stable as it was spectacular. However, the sun sets on every golden age. As Musa aged, the question of his succession began to cast a shadow over the empire. He had built a system that relied on the strength and vision of a single man. Could Mali survive without its golden king?
could his sons maintain the balance between the gold of the south and the wisdom of the north. Every sunset marks the end of a day, and even the most brilliant golden age must eventually face the coming of the night. In the year 1337, after a reign of 25 years that transformed the face of Africa and the economy of the world, Mansa Musa passed away. He left behind an empire at the absolute pinnacle of its power, a territory that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the deep interior of the Sahara, and a reputation that had reached the corners of Asia and Europe. Musa's death was not just the loss of a ruler, it was the loss of the glue that held the diverse federation of Mali together. He was succeeded by his son, Mansa Musa, but the transition revealed the inherent weakness of an empire built on the charisma and vision of a single individual. Musa lacked his father's diplomatic genius and administrative grip. Within just a few years of Musa's passing, the edges of the empire began to fray. The Mossi people to the south began raiding the borders, and the city of Timbuktu, the crown jewel of the empire, was briefly occupied by invaders. The gold still flowed, but the firm hand that guided its distribution was gone. Following Musa's short and troubled reign, Mansa Suleiman took the throne. Suleiman was a much more capable administrator and managed to stabilize the empire for nearly 24 years. He was the king who met the famous traveler Ibn Battuta, who recorded that while the kingdom was rich and safe, Suleiman was far more miserly than the legendary Musa. The stories of gold being handed out like sand were replaced by accounts of strict taxes and rigid court protocols. However, even Suleiman's stability could not stop the inevitable. Below the surface, the Mali Empire was suffering from the curse of succession. Dynastic disputes began to tear the royal family apart. Civil wars between different branches of the Keita dynasty drained the treasury that Musa had so carefully built. As the central government in Niani weakened, the vassal states, nations that had been conquered by Musa, began to realize they no longer needed to pay tribute.
To the east, the city-state of Gao began to grow in power. These were the Songhai people, and they were destined to become the next masters of West Africa. By the late 1400s, the Songhai Empire had eclipsed Mali, seizing Timbuktu and the gold trade routes that were once Musa's pride. As the physical empire of Mali shrunk into a small local kingdom, its legend only grew larger in the minds of outsiders. For centuries after Musa's death, the name Timbuktu became synonymous with a place of impossible wealth and mystery. Because the Sahara was so difficult for Europeans to cross, they could only rely on the exaggerated accounts of medieval travelers. They imagined a city where the streets were paved with gold and the roofs of the houses were made of silver. This myth fueled the Age of Discovery. European explorers like Mungo Park and René Caillet risked their lives to reach Timbuktu, driven by the ghost of Mansa Musa's gold. When they finally arrived in the 19th century, they didn't find a city of gold. They found a dusty town of mud brick houses struggling against the encroaching desert. They were disappointed because they were looking for physical gold, missing the true treasure Musa had left behind, the hundreds of thousands of manuscripts hidden in private family libraries, preserving centuries of African history, science, and philosophy. For a long time, the story of Mansa Musa was forgotten or dismissed by Western historians who couldn't believe an African king could be the richest man in history. But in the 21st century, the legend has returned with a vengeance. Economic historians and mathematicians have attempted to adjust Musa's wealth for inflation. While numbers like $400 billion or $600 billion are often thrown around, most experts agree that his wealth was incalculable. He was richer than anyone could possibly describe. But Musa's legacy is not just about the money. He's remembered today as a visionary who proved that Africa was a center of global civilization long before the colonial era.
He used his wealth to build schools, libraries, and mosques that still stand as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. He put his people on the world map not through war, but through trade, education, and an act of extreme generosity that still resonates in the markets of Cairo today. He showed that the greatest power an empire can have is not its army, but its ability to foster knowledge and culture. Today, when we look at the ruins of the Mali Empire or the towering earthen walls of the Djinguereber Mosque, we're not just looking at the past, we are looking at the vision of a man who believed that the desert was not a barrier, but a bridge. Mansa Musa was the man who turned sand into gold and gold into a legacy of light. He remains a symbol of African excellence, a king who reached for the stars and brought the world to his doorstep. The Empire of Mali may have vanished into the dust of the Sahara, but the Golden King remains immortal. His story is a reminder that wealth is temporary, but the mosques we build and the books we write are the things that truly endure.